Welcome to Real Coaching Radio, the podcast for coaches by coaches. We are here to teach you how to get the most out of your clients and yourself. This is where beauty meets the beast, brains meet brawn, and science meets, well, bro science. Welcome to Real Coaching Radio. Welcome to today's episode of the podcast. Today, me and Mark discuss all things muscle building, all things hypertrophy. We discuss why muscle is important for day-to-day life, what rep ranges build the most muscle, and the three main mechanisms that go into hypertrophy. We also talk about how to structure your training and how to write programs for yourself or your clients if your goal is muscle building. This conversation is more about how to approach your training and how to approach the longevity of training when it comes to muscle building. We all think bodybuilders, we all think these big guys, but muscle building can help you in loads of different ways. It can help you in your sports, it can help you in, again, your day-to-day life. It can help you in all different aspects. So take this episode and apply it to your own training, plug it into your life in some way, shape or form, because we can all get benefits from having a little bit more muscle. So without any further ado, let's get on with the show. If someone's listening now and their main goal is to build as much muscle as possible, how do they go about it? What are the things that go into muscle building? How do we approach muscle building? Because it can be quite confusing for some people. So where do we start?
I would say the best place to start is maybe just generally talking about rep ranges.
Yes.
So, because obviously we've got there's this thing that we know, like the strength endurance continuum. So essentially we can train in any given rep range between 1 rep up into, kind of strength and continuum generally caps at like 20-25 reps, but obviously people can go way beyond that into endurance. And it's kind of like put to us that if we train at this sort of like lower end rep range, the 1s to 5s, the 3s to 5s, then that's a rep range that's targeted for strength. If we train somewhere in the middle, like the 8 to 10, 8 to 12 sort of rep range, then that's a rep range that's targeted towards muscular hypertrophy. And then anything beyond that, we start dipping into this world of muscular endurance. And I think sometimes that, if you were new to this, you would look at that and think, right, I have to train in this rep range of 8 to 12. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to build muscle.
Well, that's kind of, I think ultimately it's weird because when you look at kind of, again, the mix between science and bro science is like, bro science says 8 to 12 rep range, probably because the studies show 8 to 12 rep range, right? So a lot of the studies probably show you do build most muscle in that rep range in like a controlled period of time. So if it's like a 4 or 8 week block, then probably. But I feel like people get stuck on that, and soon that can lead to kind of almost hitting a wall, kind of a plateaus. And
I think that rep range is just probably like, it's 10, isn't it? So like, go into the gym, just like pick a number, like it's 10, just do 10. Like
I just think that when I first started, it genuinely was that. It was a case of
3 sets of 10, everything.
Everything. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because starting there to build muscle, again, it probably is the ideal place. But I think you can miss out on the adaptations that you get from going lower, going higher.
Yeah. So, in order for a muscle to build muscle, in order for you to build additional tissue, essentially we need to stimulate the muscle. And then during this adaptation phase that we have, which generally happens a lot when we sleep and when we recover, that's when we start to build muscle tissue. We don't build any tissue whilst we're in the gym. We break down muscle tissue whilst we're in the gym. And it's through this adaptive response that we start to gain more muscle tissue. And we can stimulate muscle tissue in many different ways and across many different rep ranges. So the reality is, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm going to say it doesn't matter. Like, we can get into some of the nuances a bit later on, but like, it doesn't matter like which rep range you're training in. Like, you can build muscle tissue in any given rep range. And I think that's probably quite an important thing for people to understand anyway, but maybe even more so important now if, you know, we're in this like worldwide pandemic situation. The UK at the moment is still in lockdown. People have access to limited kit. People don't have access to loads of external load. So there's plenty of things that you can still do with your own body weight to help you build muscle tissue.
Yeah, and that's I think the best way to kind of explain how the two different ways, the low rep range and the high rep range can both build muscle, is when you look at the two different types of lifters. When you look at powerlifters a lot of times are big guys, right? They've got a lot of size on them, a lot of mass. And then when you look at bodybuilders, really big guys, and obviously that's their, a lot of times their job is to build as much muscle as possible. That's their aim. And probably both of them a lot of times train in different ways, unless you get the crossovers like the Ronnie Colemans who basically would train really heavy and was a bodybuilder. It's very rare you get the mix of someone who's in both sports, the powerlifting world and the bodybuilding world. And a lot of times the two are so different in the way that powerlifters probably do kind of that 3 to 5 rep range is a lot of their training. And when you look at bodybuilders, 8 to 12 rep range probably is where they sit the most, but then they're throwing supersets, they're throwing drop sets, they're probably, again, going more towards the higher end of this kind of like spectrum when it comes to rep ranges. So it's like you do have two different types of lifters, and you can see that both can build muscle.
Yeah, and and that just shows that kind of, you know, we can train in multiple different ways and still be able to build muscle tissue. And kind of what you've just described, probably, you know, there's generally two camps that, you know, somebody either lives in one of two camps when it comes to building muscle tissue. They either live in this intensity camp, and their training is based around, you know, training at a real high intensity. For you to train at a real high intensity, generally the volume is going to be much lower. That might be geared towards some form of powerlifting based approach in one way or another, but not, you know, they don't have to be a powerlifter to do that. They can still be a bodybuilder. There are some bodybuilders who have this high intensity approach, low volume, mega high intensity, and it's just like a lot of heavy weight all of the time. Or you have people in the camp of volume. So the intensity is much lower, and they're just trying to accrue as much volume really as they possibly can within their sessions. So rep ranges are potentially slightly higher, sets are potentially slightly higher, and it gets periodized in a slightly different way. So generally people fall into one of those two camps.
Yeah. And the thing that I find kind of I like to see about it is, we spoke in one of the other episodes, and we said about experimenting with your own training, right? And I think that's some of the things that I want to start trying to do a little bit more, is to experiment with my training and actually take note of the benefits that I get from it. Because I genuinely feel that maybe when I do my 5x5 and I'm kind of in what a classic strength program, I probably feel as if I'm building the most muscle. And I feel that may work the best for me. Now, I feel like that may be because it's 5 reps and I could probably push the most, and I could probably push towards failure, because a lot of times it is that pushing towards that failure aspect which probably does build muscle, if I'm correct. Yeah.
So one of the biggest principles that we need to apply to all of our training is this principle of progressive overload. And really, regardless of which camp that you fall into, progressive overload needs to be in there in one way or another. We need to find a way to expose our body to a novel stimulus.
Right.
And in a lot of the cases, if you fall in this intensity camp, or you jump on some form of strength-based training program, the idea of progressive overload comes from adding more weight.
Yeah.
So as an example, I remember I'm probably going back I don't know, where are we now? 2021. I'm probably going back maybe 5 or 6 years. I did a Russian strength program called Smolov.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Like, so it's a 12-week squat program. I think it's 12 weeks. I'm sure it's 12 weeks. 12-week squat program, and like every week it just gets heavier, basically. But there is also a fair amount of volume. I was squatting 4 days a week.
Yeah.
So the volume was high.
And the frequency, like the frequency of hitting your muscles is that's a lot.
I mean, I was going into the gym and kind of like on Monday, I was doing 4 sets of 9, and that was it for squatting. So like there was nothing. It wasn't like a full leg day 4 days a week. Do you know what I mean? But by the end of that program, I know for a fact that I significantly increased my strength.
Yeah.
And my quads were jacked, to be fair. Like I had big quads. So yeah, like, but going along the lines of what you just said in terms of experimenting, I've experimented with both of these camps really, in terms of I used to do a lot of high volume training when I was a bit younger. I dipped my toe into like some of the real high intensity based training, and now I kind of like to mix up both really within my training. But I think experimenting with it is worth doing for some people if you're a new lifter, because the biggest reason I would say this is we know that there's people out there who on social media who really really believe in this high intensity camp, and they're massive, like they're big, and they live that life. And then there's people who really believe in the higher volume side of things, but again, like they're also massive.
Right.
So like if we don't just necessarily, I mean, you can look at, I like to take a view of, yes, I read research and I look at research papers and have done that for a long period of time. But I do think there's an area that people have to look into and just be like, well, who's this guy that's been physically living this life for the last 10 years? Like, look at him. Yeah. Like, and then there's this guy who's been living this life for the last 10 years. Like, look at him. Like, because they're real life
examples.
Exactly.
And that's because when you look at what works for one person may not work for another person. And when you're writing programs, if you're a coach, or you're maybe just writing your own program, maybe copying your friends, or maybe just giving your client the program that works for you, may not be the best approach. And there's a number of different factors. I mean, if it's an intensity based thing, do they have the ability to keep form when they're going to kind of like the higher weights, and are they able to get the most out of each exercise when doing that? And do they genuinely just have the balls to do that? Because a lot of times, like when you're going for high intensity, and this is why, intensity and volume gets confused. And the reason I think it gets confused is when you say intensity, people think like when you're my age, because this is all we've seen through watching people on Instagram, you think drop sets, you think to failure, you think things like that. You don't necessarily think 3 reps. But when we talk about intensity, that's what we're talking about, right? Yeah.
So when we talk about intensity for cardiovascular training, and I know it's like going slightly off tangent, but it might help make it clearer for some people. When we think about intensity for cardiovascular training, we're talking about high heart rate work. Like, so your heart rate is through the roof. You're like 85% maximum heart rate plus, and you're doing high intensity work. When we talk about intensity for resistance training, we're talking about being quite close towards this 1 rep max. Right. So a 1 rep max being the most amount of weight you can put on the bar, and you can perform 1 good, clean repetition with good form. And then essentially, like the closer you get to that in terms of within your training is classed as more higher intensity work. So 2 reps, 3 reps, 5 reps, maybe 6 to 8 reps, like potentially. But yeah, you're right. Like some people perceive kind of like supersets and drop sets and all this sort of stuff to be like high intensity work. And in reality, like it's probably closer to higher volume work because the weight has to be lower.
Yes.
But people, it's funny because that's just people's perception, isn't it, of high intensity. So they get these if you do supersets and you do drop sets and everything else that fall into the kind of like that sort of umbrella, if you like, when you do these, you experience pain. You experience like you experience like this muscle soreness, and well, not necessarily muscle soreness that they're in, but like this muscle pain and this sensation, that this burning sensation in your legs, in your chest, whatever it is that you're training, and then people perceive that to be high intensity.
Because it's hard, because you're out of breath, it hurts the most. That's got to be the most intense thing.
Yeah.
And so for example, if I message a client, we're going to be taking you through, like the intensity is going to be going up, and the response I get is either, so we're going to do loads of drop sets, or so we're going to do like 30-second rest periods. And I think the perception is because it's hard. It's hard. That must be the most intense thing. But this is where, again, it gets really confusing, or it needs to be approached correctly when you're a coach, is because what is most intense for that person? If you ignore volume and intensity being separate things, just look at what work is the hardest for that person. Because if it is maybe the drop sets and the supersets they find really taxing, could that be because their cardiovascular system could do with some work to help with their recovery, to make it a little bit easier? So do you focus on doing something like that so you can maybe push them through those kind of phases and through those rep schemes? Or is the higher intensity work when we're going to the like between that 1 to 5 rep range, is that the hardest for them because they've got so much thinking to do about controlling their body and things like that? They're probably not ready for it. So when you approach training programs, when you approach kind of giving something to your clients, just because Ronnie Coleman was absolutely jacked and squatted 800 pounds for 2 doesn't mean putting your client through a strength phase is the right moment or the right time. And don't just think about the hypertrophy talk as well, just along the lines of bodybuilders and powerlifters. I know we're using them as an example, but there are a lot of other things, right, that go into the benefit from having muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about, and we have for the all through this podcast so far, like you talk about hypertrophy and people's instant responses, they go towards bodybuilding. But there are a huge amount of benefits to gaining muscle tissue outside of that, like not even becoming close to becoming a bodybuilder. So for, I guess one of the biggest overall things that having a little bit of additional muscle tissue will do is just make you a little bit more of a robust individual. So if you play sport, as an example, you had a little bit more muscle tissue, you'd just become a little bit more robust. You'd be able to handle a little bit more. Your tolerance would increase. Even just relating that to kind of like everyday life. Like if you just, when you're, if you're gardening, or if you're like clearing out a garage, or you're moving house and, you're having to move stuff around, or you go shopping, anything really, like we can relate it to all aspects of life. But if you're firstly just like a little bit more robust, you're going to find some of those tasks a bit easier.
I look at my grandparents when I talk about this. And the reason is because a lot of times when you look at our grandparents, they probably, unless they're a bodybuilder, probably don't have that much muscle tissue on them, right? So I look at that and I look at muscle tissue as a bit of insurance, because like a lot of times when I got injured, for example, when I dislocated my shoulder, I was like 11 stone wet, right? And I was skin and bones running around on a rugby pitch, getting ran over by 6'4" blokes. Of course, my shoulder's going to pop out. And my shoulder dislocating when it happened, to be fair, it was actually when I was in Colts, and the guy who I tackled was probably smaller than me at the time, but a hip bone is a lot stronger than than my shoulder, I must admit. So when that happened, and I realized that I just didn't have enough protection around my muscles, and the reason I bring up grandparents is because for older people and older generations, if you've got an older client, I'd probably recommend some form of resistance training. And I'm not talking bodybuilding. I'm talking
Yeah.
just to get them like to build up a little bit of strength and like proprioception around the muscles, how they move. Because a lot of times, like if it, a lot, I know my granddad said this to me before. If you and this is quite bad, but he said you break your hip and you die from pneumonia. Because he said that to me in the way that if you fall over, hurt yourself, and then your kind of immune system's probably so low that it gets attacked from whatever when you go into hospital. But the point is, they don't have the ability to keep themselves upright. So if older people fall over, it's probably because they don't have the muscle or the understanding of how their body moves.
Yeah. So like one of the biggest reasons that the elderly end up in hospital is because they fall.
Right.
And some of the major considerations that we need to take into account as to why they fall is generally as we start to get older, we know that, and you know, people have seen this, like as they look at some of the elderly, and their posture starts to change, so their spinal position starts to change, and which therefore changes their center of mass, which therefore throws their balance off, and they start to fall over. So and strength training and hypertrophy can have a benefit to that from multiple different ways. Like firstly, if we do some good quality strength work and build a little bit of muscle tissue, we could help maintain some of those more upright postures as we get older.
My nan, I swear to God, has like shrank a foot.
Yeah, right.
And it is just because of posture.
Yeah. And so we can help improve postural positions through gaining some hypertrophy and also increasing some strength. And also if they have like a little bit of additional muscle tissue, then they might be a little bit more robust. So if they do fall over, like they might be able to handle that a little bit more.
I listened to a podcast once about, it was talking about prisoners of war, and they were basically saying that they were so like malnourished, they had so little kind of muscle and like body fat on them that when they'd lay on the floor, it was like pretty much bone to concrete.
Right, yeah.
And like, like if you hit your elbow or you like bang your knee, when you do something like bone to something hard, that hurts. And imagine you had no protection anywhere else on your body. Yeah. So everything's pretty much bone, like your bones are not exposed, but you know what I mean? So the risk is probably higher and it probably is going to be more painful.
Yeah. Yeah, so building and not even just from a postural and injury point of view for the elderly, like a little bit of resistance training is just going to help maintain some bone mineral density.
Right.
So, as people's bones start to become slightly more brittle as they get older, again, we can help delay some of that process. Yeah. By doing some resistance training, whether that be going for a walk or whether that be in the gym, like use it. And again, like you don't take any of this sort of stuff out of context. Like this is the same with any coaching, like regardless of who the client is, you have to, one of the art forms of coaching is being able to meet the client where they're at.
If your client comes in and struggles to stand up and down off of a chair, that's a squat, right? So like that movement of standing someone up and down off of a chair is a form of resistance training.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know we are a society of extremes. So when we think hypertrophy, we think muscle building. But injury prevention and things like that are so many things that go into it. Again, making you more robust. What else would you say kind of is a benefit of hypertrophy?
Like injury prevention, like structural integrity of tissue. There is going to be a benefit for some people who play sport in terms of there will be some increased force production from their muscle tissue. They will have an ability to start to be able to produce more force. So, whether they play any form of like real athletic based sport, whether that be like football, rugby, or some track and field, or whether it be, some sort of like powerlifting based sport, and they're trying to recruit and accrue as much force as possible. But outside of that, again, like I would say a camp that doesn't do enough resistance training to build a small amount of muscle tissue, and again, we're not talking bodybuilder level, would be somebody who does a lot of endurance based work.
Yeah, so your long distance runners and things like that.
Yeah.
So am I right in saying that when you say athletes, I think of sprinters and I think of massive legs, jack quads, right? But when you look at endurance runners, a lot of times they are slimmer. So when you're saying muscle for long distance, we're not talking the same level, right?
No.
So it's all specific to your outlet, your sport, the desired result you're looking for.
Absolutely. And the biggest reason for it would be they don't always necessarily go completely hand in hand, but if you gain a little bit of muscle tissue, you're going to be a little bit stronger. Like if you look at some of the biggest bodybuilders, and again, I know that's an extreme example, but sometimes to see good examples, you go to extremes because success leaves clues. Like, and if you go to some of the biggest bodybuilders, like generally they're also some of the strongest bodybuilders. Yeah. So there's a link between how strong you are and how much muscle tissue you have. And if take endurance running or any form of endurance sport as an example, there's an energy cost to what it is that you're doing. So every time you run and every time your foot hits the ground when you do run, there's an energy cost. Yeah. And depending on how strong you are relative to how much you weigh, depends on how much that cost is. So if you're weaker compared to how much you weigh, that cost is going to be higher. Yep. Right? So if I can weigh the same or ever so slightly more, I guess, if I'm gaining a little bit of muscle tissue, but I'm also increasing in strength a little bit, then every time my foot hits the ground, that energy cost becomes less. So my running economy is going to increase. There's been no physiological change to my VO2 max or anything to do with my cardiovascular physiology, but my running economy is increased because my energy cost is less.
Yeah, and you can do that as an example with yourself. If you go to the gym with someone, maybe one of your friends, either you brought them along 6 months after you started, or you followed them along 6 months after, and they are maybe a little bit stronger than you. If you put the same weight on a leg press, for example, and they do more reps than you, or they do the same amount of reps, you're absolutely hanging and they're fine. It's because of that, because they are stronger, because they have that ability, and it costs them less to produce the same amount of force that it costs you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So just going back to one of the things that we spoke about when we were talking about this intensity and volume, I think one of the things that people should need to consider is, because like we said earlier, they do both work. And before we get into some of the details around building muscle tissue, I think one thing that people should realize is that because we can see that they both work, whether it's high intensity, whether it's high volume, they both have an ability to build muscle tissue. I would say that you need to, whether you do this through experiment and trying both, you probably need to go down the route of which one you get more satisfaction from in terms of training, because it's the same with everything. We've said this on a couple of other podcasts, but we say it a lot because it's true. Like, adherence is the biggest driving factor. So if you are somebody, as an example, who prefers more higher volume based training, like you prefer supersets, you prefer drop sets, and you're really trying to drive yourself into doing more higher intensity work to build muscle tissue, but you hate doing it, the reality is at some point you're going to stop doing it. So because you're doing it because you believe it might be more optimal for you, but then you're not doing it. So it doesn't matter how optimal it is because you're not doing it.
A poor program performed consistently is better than an optimal program performed inconsistently.
Absolutely.
Every time.
Yeah.
So make sure so I learned this because one of my friends loves supersets. I love strength phases. Obviously, us training together is not a good idea because we're opposite ends of the spectrum. And me trying to force him into doing my way of training, or him trying to force me into doing his way of training, just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that's because we like certain things, and neither of them are wrong. And that's the point. Is if you do prefer more low rep range, enjoy yourself. You're going to build muscle.
Absolutely.
If you do prefer higher rep range, enjoy yourself. You're probably going to build muscle.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't matter. There's not, and if you enjoy all of them, do all of them. Kind of, we'll get into structure and how we structure our programs and stuff later on. But the main thing is, do you enjoy it?
Yeah, because the other thing you've got to consider, and this is one of the biggest things you've got to consider, and it's important to do the thing that you enjoy, is that Muscle tissue is an expensive piece of tissue. The human body doesn't necessarily like having lots of it.
Unless it has to.
Yeah.
So unless you're telling it.
Yeah. So it is an expensive piece of tissue and it's hard to get. So if you want to get bigger, like you've got to play the long game.
Yes, unless you are going to find the I'm going to put quote unquote cheap method to kind of gain that, then which is completely individual and up to you, which is fine. I'd suggest that you realize how much of a long game this is.
Yeah.
Because it is a huge long game. And that's why when I talk about health and fitness, it's a lifestyle. And the reason people say it's a lifestyle, but again, it's confusing because when we say lifestyle, I don't mean you have to live the life of fitness. I mean you have to incorporate these healthy habits into your life. And if that is lifting weights, then go into the gym 3 days a week, or maybe you can only go 1 day a week because you're so busy, or maybe you can go 6 days a week because you've got nothing on. Either of those are fine. Just making something that fits into your life is going to be more beneficial than anything else. Whether maintaining at the time is correct or whether building muscle is your goal, you understand that it is important to do these things. So when you look at it as a lifestyle and look at it as a long game, look at it as something that you're going to do for the rest of your life, whether it's 3 days a week, whether it's 1 day a week, but it's something you're going to incorporate. And that may change from weight training and bench pressing to being, when you're 80, go and walk around a golf course. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of...
Yeah. Yeah, because I've had clients in the past who just be like, well, how do I get arms like yours? Just be like, mate, I've been training for 17 years.
So this is another point. And going back to this, when you said about clients, if you're a client who does prefer a certain way of training, yet you haven't kind of said that to your coach, and your coach has given you a completely different method or a different approach, say something. Because as soon as you stop doing it, it's going to be so confusing for your coaches. Yeah. Why is this person stopped? They were so good before. And if you are a coach and maybe your client hasn't told you and they've kind of been a little bit more inconsistent, it could be they're just not enjoying it. So if you're a client and you have a coach, don't feel like you don't have the right to say, I really enjoy doing this type of training, and reminding them, I prefer the 8 to 12 rep range. Yep. I prefer cardiovascular work. Let them know so you can be more consistent.
Yeah, so you have to have that open line of communication, really.
So I've absolutely gone off on a tangent, which is brilliant. So we want to talk about the 3 main mechanisms that go into hypertrophy, that go into building muscle. So what are they? What's the most important? How do we do it?
Yeah, so we have 3 mechanisms really to build muscular hypertrophy. And we'll go into detail in them in a second. But essentially, we've got something called mechanical tension. There is something called metabolic stress, and then the third one would be muscle damage.
Pain.
So it seems to be that mechanical tension is the biggest driver for gaining muscle tissue out of the 3 of them, essentially. So when we talk about mechanical tension, we're talking about starting to produce force. So we can start to look at how we place the most amount of mechanical tension on the muscle tissue. And one of the biggest ways, and the simplest ways, if you like, not necessarily the easiest ways because it's hard, but the simplest ways to do it is to follow that principle of progressive overload. And not necessarily completely submerge, but certainly start to go into that camp of some slightly higher intensity work, so heavier weights essentially.
Yeah, and the progressive overload can be applied to whichever rep range you're in. So if you are in an 8 to 12 rep range, for example, and 1 week you come in and you do 4 sets of 8 at 100 kg, next week you come in, you could do 4 sets of 10 at 100 kg, or you could do 4 sets of 8 at 102 kg.
Yeah.
That is progressive overload, same as going in a 5 rep range and a 3 rep range. It doesn't matter. Progressive overload is more load.
Yeah. More load more reps at the same load.
Yeah.
And I think what is really important for people to understand when it comes to progressive overload is, again, like everybody has this like extreme mindset of what you don't want to do is, and you kind of want to do what you described, but what you don't want to do is, like, let's say you go in and you back squat, I don't know, like you said, 4 sets of 10 at 100 kilos. Don't go in the following week and be like, right, I'll do 4 sets of 10 at 110 kilos.
Understand how big the jumps feel when you get to that top end, because they are going from maybe the bar to 60 kg in that scenario. That's probably reasonably okay. That's like not too bad. If I'm going to do 4 sets of 10 at 100, that jump from the bar at 20 kg to 60 kg on the bar is nothing. But if you literally put 10 kg on the bar the next week, you can probably almost guarantee that's going down to maybe even a 6 rep. Yeah,
but also, like, even if in the scenario, let's say you do manage to hit 10, how many weeks do you think you're going to go consistently adding 10 reps to the bar? Like, you're not.
Just the way I always explain it to clients, even if you added 1 kg to the bar every week, that's 50 kg in a year.
Exactly.
If you tell me my bench is going to go up by 50 kg in a year,
you're taking it.
I'm taking it.
Yeah.
There is a real big emphasis on smaller steps.
Yeah.
The tortoise and the hare with this when it comes to progressive overload, smaller jumps.
But this is the biggest problem I see with, like, a lot of people who come into resistance training or do some form of resistance training, is they're just not willing to be patient enough. Like you've just described, kind of, I'm going to gain X amount of kilos, if like 50 kilos in a year. Like, but people aren't looking a year away. They're looking, right, well, so how big can I get in 6 weeks?
Everyone wants the PB. Everyone wants the body. Everyone wants the progress pics. Everyone wants the gratification of the now, and no one wants to enjoy the journey for the future. And that's the thing that really bothers me with training, is when you look for quick ways out, when you look for the quick option or the thing that's going to get you there the fastest, you probably miss out on a ton of other things, and you probably miss out on the important things of going forward. If you think you could put 10 kg on the bar every single week, you're crazy. You are absolutely crazy.
You're not doing that for very long.
You're not, unless you're a beginner, because beginner gains, newbie gains, like that may happen. But if you're someone who's been lifting for a while, expect to play the long game. And do you know the thing that's really annoying? Is when you see someone who has played the long game, in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, who are much bigger than you and much stronger than you, and I'm like, bro, we've been training for the same amount of time, and you're massive.
Yeah,
and that's because they play the long game, and that's because I come in when I'm 18 and try to take my deadlift from 140 to 200.
Yeah,
because I'm an idiot.
It's exactly that. Like you look at some of those people who have been like incredibly consistent and followed that process. Yeah, you give them a year, you give them 2 years, you give them 3 years, and they're in a very different place to what you are.
And you can put that on yourself. Be that example. Be that person.
Yeah. So I remember when I did like some more higher intensity work, like I literally would take a lift and log everything, and then every week on week I would just add half a kilo.
The half kilo plates are my favorite in this that we have, because they change the way you lift. And the reason they change the way you lift is when I come in and I bench, or I come in and I squat, if I'm doing that 5x5 that I've said before, if they were all 100 kg the week before, well, the next week maybe my middle 3 sets are going to be 101 kg. And it may seem really small, and it is really small, but that little adaptation stops me from getting to the point where I just burn myself out, or I fail a lift, or I do something like that.
Yep.
Progressive overload needs to be applied with a smart brain in moderation almost. If you think you're going to add 5 kg to the bar, probably add 2.5. Probably add 1 kg. Go less is more in this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's other ways that we can start to add some mechanical tension, which do play a huge part in gaining some muscular hypertrophy. Probably not as much as something like progressive overload and going heavier all of the time, but they do definitely still have their place. And that would be things like tempo-based training. So slowing it down. So, you might hit a back squat and you do kind of like a 3-second eccentric, a 1 to 2 second pause at the bottom, and then drive back out of that squat. So you're placing more tension on the muscle for a longer period of time. And that might start to dip into one of the other mechanisms that we're going to talk about as well. But again, like, everything has to be, exercise is dynamic, fitness is dynamic, everything has to be dynamic. It's not black and white. It's not like, I'm training 5 reps and now I'm definitely gaining strength, but now I'm training 6 reps and I'm definitely gaining muscle. Like, it doesn't work that way. It's this continuum, isn't it?
Everything works, but nothing works for forever. So pick which tool you're going to use at which time, I guess. And the reason I love tempo training, the reason I love things like that, is because you really have to start to control what you do. And that's the one thing that I like to put it into clients' programs, is because if you've got to do a 4-second eccentric, if you've got a pause at the bottom, then you've actually got to control everything you're doing. We've said it a ton of times. If you see someone going for a movement super quick, it's probably because they can't control it. And being able to control it, again, is one of these things, this tempo work, which does drive mechanical tension.
Absolutely. Like, tempo training is probably one of the initial methods of training that I use with a lot of clients, just because, it improves their proprioception, it improves their body awareness, it allows them to hopefully get into better positions, have more control. So tempo work is something that I do quite a lot of at the beginning with clients.
You can gain muscle with minimal load, which means
Exactly.
the risk isn't that high, which is why doing that approach to start with is the best thing. Because my always thing is, like, let's always have somewhere to go. Do you know what I mean? If you're chucking loads of weight on the bar to start with, then it's not that you can't use these other tools, but it's just like, let's walk before we can run type thing. Let's do the things in order.
Yeah, and that's another thing that kind of gets pulled into one of these 2 camps that we spoke about earlier. Like, if you're in this high intensity camp, like, a lot of the time these people have this mindset of, and it's a mindset that's based around progressive overload. So there's some scientific theory behind it, which means, so it's a good theory, but practically for some people it's not always the case. So they have this mindset of, like, right, you're going to go into the gym and you're only adding half a kilo, you're only maybe adding a kilo at most to your lifts, but regardless of what it is, every week you are going heavier. And for some people, they just, you think about who we're talking about who does this, like, they're extreme examples, and that doesn't necessarily relate to general population in gym environments who just want to get a little bit stronger. So
not everyone could be Larry Wills. Like,
do you know what I mean?
You genuinely can.
Yeah. And then, or like, if people are in this volume camp, like, they generally tend to kind of like auto-regulate things a little bit more. So on days where they can push, like, they will push. On days where they feel like they need to back off, like, they will back off. Like, you auto-regulate almost day by day, if you like. So, if you're going into the gym one day and you've got some back squats, but you feel tired, you feel fatigued, you can still gain some great benefits from training it, and that's where tempo training might be a favor to you. If you're not really feeling on this one day that you're not really feeling the heavy weight, you can put less weight on the bar and move a little bit slower, ensure that you're maintaining good positions, and you're going to get more benefits from doing that than either going in and trying to put more weight on the bar, and because you're tired and fatigued, your risk of injury increases, so you could potentially get injured, which is going to put you off training for weeks, potentially months, or just completely sacking it off.
But that's the I am not perfect at this, and I'm trying to get better at reminding myself that working on the skill of the movements is just as much benefit as going in and putting loads of weight on the bar. Because ego kicks in, we feel like we should be doing more, doing extra, because we see the people, the Larry Wills of the world PBing every week, and for you it feels as if you should be doing the same. But again, remember what the place you're in when it comes to your training. Remember where you're at, because we're not all Larry Wills. We're not
Yeah.
all these people that can go in and PB every week. So again, progressive overload, yes, putting weight on the bar is the main factor, but there are other ways to progress your training.
Yeah. And it's about, I think one of the biggest things that people need to try and do when it comes to certainly resistance training and gaining muscle tissue, because of the amount of time it takes, like sometimes people are too focused on the end goal. They're too focused on this final outcome. Whereas like just love training.
Yeah.
Like just fall in love with the process.
That's the hard bit for a lot of people. When we spoke about the goals setting, if you do have that outcome-based approach and you are constantly looking for that thing in the future, you probably take for granted where you are now, and you probably take for granted the journey you're on now. And at one point in your life, you probably wished you could be there now. The way I've always said it is like, have you ever thought to yourself, God, like I feel really fat, and then 8 months down the line, you put on a bit of weight and you're like, oh, now I'm fat. Like I wasn't fat back then.
Yeah.
I was fine back then.
Yeah.
I reckon that's because I get that, and it's amazing to me that we always and I still do it. Look to the future. The future is going to be better. When that happens, I'm going to be happy. When that thing happens, I'm going to be satisfied. But unfortunately, you're never satisfied with this process if you have that view. You get satisfied with the process when you start to enjoy the process and enjoy what the different aspects of training are, the things that go into mechanical tension and the things that go into the other two that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So yeah, mechanical tension is generally kind of, some form of progressive overload. And then if we go to almost the other end of the spectrum, if you like, in some way, we look at metabolic stress. And metabolic stress is essentially, if we were to put this into like simple terms, is kind of when you're doing exercise and like you're feeling the burn, like you're getting this burning sensation, like you're getting a bit of a pump.
Yeah.
There's metabolic stress that's taking place within the body, and to some degree, you might be able to create a degree of exercise-induced metabolic stress through tempo training. Yeah. Because if you do it for long enough, in terms of, your set lasts long enough, if you're doing like 10 reps and you're kind of if you're doing 10 reps and a rep is taking 6 seconds,
yeah,
you're under tension for a long amount of time as you're going through this whole full set. Like it's a whole minute of work. That's a long time to be squatting.
It is a long time, and that's the thing that if you look at failure as the top end, or you look at progressing as the top end, it can be in these different forms. Because if you do tempo work, again, it may take six seconds to complete a rep, and if you're doing 10 reps, that's 60 seconds. So the probably weight's going to be a lot less than if you're doing 2 seconds a rep.
Yeah, and you're going to start to get this like metabolite accumulation if you're doing that for 60 seconds because of energy systems and how long we're working for.
So the metabolic stress, then the getting the pump. Is that's the metabolic stress.
Essentially, like if you were to relate that to kind of like a bit more of a simple term, if you like, then yeah, like if you're chasing the pump and through things like supersets, drop sets, higher repetitions, then you're going to start to experience some form of metabolic stress. As long as you probably need to continue. If you feel like the pump's coming and then you stop, like you probably need to continue a little bit further into that. Like people need to start to, and this is one of the reasons why the conversation we had earlier around when we've just clarified what high intensity training was. This is the reason why people think higher rep ranges and drop sets is higher intensity training, because when you're driving into this metabolic stress area, like you're going to a point of where it's painful. And it burns, and this lactate accumulation, this acid buildup in the blood, is giving you this burning sensation.
Well, that's the difference between the fatigue that you get when it comes to training. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I've always looked at it is when I'm doing strength training, my central nervous system has to fire so much because I've got to incorporate a lot of muscle fibers, right? I've got to produce as much force as possible, as much output as possible, and my CNS is going crazy. And that's the fatigue I'm feeling. I'm feeling the fatigue on my central nervous system.
Yeah.
Whereas when I go and chase a pump, when I'm trying to feel the burn as such, I'm probably going to feel more muscle kind of fatigue, right?
Yeah, a little bit more localized fatigue, right?
So the stress is different, and the intensity is it gets measured in a different way. So when I measure intensity, I measure how tired it makes me feel because of my central nervous system, not how much it hurts.
Yeah.
Which probably takes us on to the third one.
Yeah, so the third one is a mechanism within itself, and it's muscle damage. But we can get muscle damage through mechanical tension.
Yeah.
We can get muscle damage through metabolic stress. So although it's seen as a mechanism by itself, the reason we've left it to last is because we can probably get this damage through both of these. However, there are some methods that we can use that's going to create some damage that we haven't spoken about yet. And that would essentially be, so people can start performing, we touched on it with tempo training, but essentially people really start performing like pure eccentric training. Like I remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, and I did some Nordic curls.
Yeah.
And I hadn't done Nordic curls for probably the best part of a year. And in my session, I did a total of 9 repetitions. If you don't know what a Nordic curl is, it's quite difficult to explain, but like a quick Google search will bring it up. And I did a total of 9 reps across 3 sets. And I had DOMs in my hamstrings for probably 5 days.
So I'm going to suggest, if you haven't tried them, please try them and start to see what we're talking about, because I don't think there is not an exercise which makes my hamstrings feel like that.
Yeah, right.
And result into tears is probably
it's hard.
It is. Nordics are amazing, but those eccentrics are almost essential when it comes to DOMs, right?
Yeah, I mean, if muscle damage is one of the things that you're trying to achieve, if you like, and it's one of the mechanisms you're trying to achieve, then eccentric training is probably one of the best ways to achieve that.
So quickly, because I want to clarify this, when I talk about DOMs, when we talk about muscle damage, I want you to think about what goes into it rather than chasing that feeling itself. So rather than chasing that feeling of like being sore and things like that, think about using things like eccentrics, right, in your training to maybe create that adaptation, to create that thing you're looking for, but don't have that as the main thing you want, if that makes sense. Try to have the kind of the processes that go into it to make the muscle damage, rather than going, I just got to get sore.
Yeah, because having this, I had DOMs in my hamstrings for 5 days, and all that really did was prevented me from having some really effective sessions 2 or 3 days after that, where I wanted to. Like I was meant to deadlift like 3 days after I did those, and I did deadlift, but I didn't deadlift to the weight that I kind of really wanted to get to. So it goes back to that scenario of like trusting the process almost, but like chasing DOMs isn't necessarily the smartest way to train.
And you could have probably done 2 sets. You probably could have done 1 set, and you'd have probably got some. If the novelty of doing that, if you haven't done that for a while, is probably enough to give you what you need. Yeah,
and on that point, that did lead me on to my next point really well. It's kind of like one of the other best ways to create some DOMs is to do an exercise that's novel.
Yeah.
So an exercise that you either haven't done for a long time, or an exercise that you've potentially never done.
I at the moment, because obviously people are home training, I'm chucking a load of random things in people's training once a week. My program is done in phases, so I'll phase a 4-week program. But each week I will try and change something to make it a little bit novel.
Yeah, add a bit of variety.
Add a bit of variety, and it keeps it fun. It is one of the things, but it also, again, is that adaptation we're looking for.
Yeah, and then probably the other biggest way to create some muscular damage is to, on really any given exercise, try and increase the range of motion. So you might go from a static split squat And then you might go to like a front foot elevated split squat. So you're just increasing the range and you're asking the muscle to go through a bigger range of motion. And to some extent, like that then becomes a bit of a novel exercise because it's something you've never done before. So those two kind of like tie hand in hand. Or even if it's just a client who you're teaching to back squat, you know, and they're able to go to a certain amount of depth and then they get comfortable and they get strong and, you know, they're able to stabilize at that depth. Your next point of call, rather than adding any additional load, really might just be, well, let's just go a bit deeper.
Literally is that, because again, if that thing of controlling, I'm going to use the term, but time under tension when it comes to being doing the negatives or doing the like slow eccentrics and getting that control is probably going to help. That novelty of going to a fuller range of motion and use fuller range of motion as part of your training, because the bodybuilding pumping style of half reps that I see a lot of the time have their place.
Yeah.
But full range of motion, I'd probably say to people, have that as a high priority when you're training.
Yeah, I think kind of like, you know, those partial reps, and this is counterintuitive to some people, but to do partial reps, I think there's a prerequisite of, I need to see that you can do full range before we start doing partials.
And because that's the thing, like deep squats, probably and this is, the deeper you go in a squat, probably the more like knee flexion you have, you probably are going to incorporate more quads. You're probably going to like start to get more muscles involved when doing these movements.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and then just one final thing on muscle damage before we kind of like move on is just very quickly talking about like recovery methods from that, because, you know, using ice baths and everything else is kind of like relatively popular at the moment. And ice baths can be useful, but it's just understanding when to use them as a tool. Because if your focus is to gain muscle tissue and you're experiencing DOMS, that's the adaptive response from exercise, and it's during that adaptive response phase that we start to build muscle tissue. Whereas just flying ice into the system is going to stop that adaptive response from happening. So if you're in a scenario where, I don't know, let's say you're in a tournament and across like 2 or 3 days or across a couple of weeks, you've got multiple events that you're having to compete in, and there's a performance-based goal. That's probably a really appropriate time to start using ice, because you need to be recovered. And at that moment in time, your goal and your focus and your objective isn't to build muscle tissue. It's to perform at the highest possible level. Whereas if you're in a phase where there's no competition, or if you play sport and it might be like a pre-season type scenario, ice probably isn't the best thing for you, because if your objective at that moment in time is to gain some hypertrophy, adding ice to the system all of the time when you've got DOMS is gonna stop that adaptive response, and you're gonna stop that response from happening. And it's when that response happens that we start to build muscle. So we almost want it.
And remember why you want it as well, because like we said, if it's going to create some robustness, if it's going to help injury prevention, it's going to do these things which are going to ultimately help you in your day-to-day life in the sport that you choose. So building muscle, there is a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
But it can be reasonably simple.
Yeah.
The main, what would you say the main takeaways are when it comes to when we write programs for ourselves, for example? How do you look at these different mechanisms that go into it, and how do you start to build a program around that?
So my own personal programs, in terms of what I do in my training now, is I try and apply a couple of these mechanisms, because that, for me, training now is just something I really enjoy doing, and I don't want to fall out of love with it. I just want to keep being able to train way into my years. So for me, I try and apply a few of these different methods. So generally the structure of my sessions, for all of my sessions, will be relatively similar. And my sessions will always begin with some form of big key compound based movement. That might be a squat, a deadlift, a bench press, something like that. And I will try and apply kind of like the mechanism of mechanical tension, if you like, towards that. My focus in one way or another will be some form of progressive overload. And whether I'm auto-regulating that or whether I'm, plugging numbers in and specifically trying to hit numbers week on week, there will be some form of progressive overload within that. I will then move into something that is a little bit more kind of metabolic stress, high volume, kind of like base scenario. So I might start putting in some supersets. I might start combining, because like I enjoy the functional fitness elements, I might start combining, I don't know, lunges with, if it's like a lower body day, lunges with some form of rowing or bike. So I get some cardiovascular aspect to that as well. There's like some metabolic stress that's going in there. There'll be a couple of like individual volume driver components to my workout. And then generally it will have some form of like finisher. So it will have like a higher intensity component. That higher intensity component for me would be looking at trying to improve cardiovascular efficiency. However, I still take into consideration like an aesthetic view. So as an example, like if it is like a bit of a lower body day, it might be some kind of Metcon short, higher intensity based workout that involves rowing, box jumps, lunges, whatever. Like, there's still a driver to the muscle that I'm trying to train, and that, it might be a lower body focused or an upper body focused, but generally there's 3 sections to my workout. So there's this big key compound based element where I'm looking at progressive overload. There's the bit in the middle where we try and drive some volume. And then there's this section at the end where we just hammer some metabolic stress.
And if you looked at all 3 of those, right, if you separate those training, the first bit, strength training, right? So you're going to use a big compound lift and it could be to drive strength.
Yeah.
The second part would be classed as a more kind of, say, bodybuilding style of training where you're looking for a more hypertrophy. And that last bit, people probably think of as conditioning. People probably think that as cardio.
Yeah.
So if you look at those 3 points, which are apparently, according to a lot of people, different ways of training, you can implement them into one program to get the desired result of muscle building, as long as you follow the rules, right? As long as you follow the mechanisms which drive hypertrophy, you can incorporate them into whichever style of training you like.
Yeah, so that's a really important point, because the method isn't necessarily kind of like the thing you want to be focused on.
What do you mean by the method?
So the method might be like supersets is a method of training.
Right.
Like, the method is neither here or there, really, to a certain extent.
The method is how you get the desired result, right? The principle is what is almost the science behind it.
Absolutely.
Right? So the principle of the principle is the why. Right? The principle is why you're doing what you're doing. The method is I'm doing this because of that, right?
Yeah, the method's like the how, isn't it? Like, how are you doing it?
Right. The method is the how. So when you see people doing supersets and stuff like that, there's a reason behind that, okay? It's to probably get some metabolic stress. It's to probably feel the burn. It's to probably get a pump, which is fine. But if you understand the principles, that's how you can start to program workouts in a correct manner. Yeah.
So govern your training based on principles, and then use methods that you enjoy.
Use the methods you enjoy, and that is ultimately it. I mean, what my training is very much focused around what I enjoy, and it is very similar. I take a big compound lift at the start. And a lot of times that is to work on a more strength. I very rarely go over 8 reps when I'm going for a big compound lift, and that's because I enjoy moving a lot of weight on those movements. But then when I do drop down into some more movements where I'm doing supersets and things like that, like I probably do go and gravitate towards a more bodybuilding style of training in the later part of my workouts. But there is something which I am looking for in each part. I'm focusing on one thing. I'm trying to build strength when I do my compound lifts, and that's probably where I'm trying to build the most strength. But in that strength building, I'm also going to get some muscle building and some adaptation happening there as well. So it is what you enjoy is probably the most important thing. Again, as always, the thing that keeps you consistent and the thing that keeps you training.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is it then. The main takeaways are probably...
Yeah, govern your training based on principles.
Is probably the main takeaway. And
Yeah.
the main principles being progressive overload.
Progressive overload, specificity. So like be specific to what it is that you're trying to train. Yeah. Progression, overload, kind of reversibility is another principle to training as well. And that's kind of like, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. So ensure that you are consistent. And then another principle to training would be kind of like tedium. So again, make sure it's something that you enjoy. It doesn't become tedious and you want to stop doing it. But ultimately, the biggest principle for you seeing progress in your training is some form of progressive overload.
Yeah, and that's going to be the progressive overload can be in a number of different things, and you can use these things like eccentrics, like going for the pump, to also aid in this pursuit of building the most muscle. And you can start to build your programs around putting eccentrics here and there, putting supersets in here and there, putting some novelty in every now and again. I mean, the thing that I do on everything is go full range of motion, so that's always in there. But these things probably will drive it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the important thing is like progressive overload doesn't just mean go heavier. Like if you're doing tempo-based training and a rep took you 5 seconds, a rep can now start to take you 6 seconds.
Yep.
It's progressive overload.
And I think there is loads of different ways which go into progressing as well in the gym. Working out, you can control the movement better. Again, eccentrics, tempo work. You could use all these different tools, but understand the use that you get out of them. So that is probably all for muscle building.
Yeah,
would you say?
I think. Oh well, there's obviously like a huge nutritional aspect that we haven't touched on, which we could probably do in another episode. But yeah, there is a huge nutritional aspect that people need to take into consideration when it comes to muscle building.
That's part of it. Is the whole topic of health and fitness is that there are so many different components. There are so many different things that go into it. There's sleep, there's everything, but the one thing that it does do, the one thing that health and fitness does do, is probably help in your day-to-day life in every single way. And whether that is going to the gym to look better, to make you feel better, so you're more confident, then that can be one of the things. If it's to go to the gym to release some stress, if it's to go to the gym to just improve your kind of cardiovascular health, then these are all things that are good. These are all things that health and fitness adds to our lives and adds to our day-to-day activity. But hopefully from this you'll be able to make some notes, work out how you're going to actually build some muscle, and understand that this long game is a long game and it's going to continue to be a long game. But if you did enjoy that, if you want to find us, if you want to connect with us, then please head over to Instagram. You can find Mark at Mark Origin Series. You can find me at Hack the Body, Hack the Mind. Thank you very much for tuning in. We will see you on the next one. Today's episode was all about muscle building. Thank you so much for tuning in. The reason I wanted to do this episode is because I want people to start thinking about muscle building as more than just the aesthetics you get from it. To think about this as all of the other benefits you can get. It will help you in your sports, your job, your day-to-day activities. Just think of muscle building instead of bodybuilders. Think about your grandparents, how it can help them. Hopefully in today's episode, we have provided you with enough information for you to start to write your own programs when it comes to muscle building and the principles to follow when doing this process. It can be quite confusing, but like everything we said in the past, you have to do what you enjoy. Consistency is the biggest thing when it comes to training, and enjoying the process is probably going to be the thing that keeps you training for the longest period of time. So enjoy your training, find something which works for you, and stick with it. If you do want any more information, if you do want to join the coaching world, then please by all means head to myptcourse.com, and we do level 2 and level 3 personal training courses. So if you do want to join the coaching world, or you just want to enhance your own experience and your own education, please head there, where you can do online courses or face-to-face courses with Mark and myself. Thank you so much once again for tuning in. This has been Real Coaching Radio.